Hello, my name is Sherlock Holmes, and every story hides a truth. Welcome to my new mystery.
The morning light filtered weakly through the curtains of Baker Street, casting a pale glow over the sitting room. Outside, the streets of London were glazed with frost and a mist hung low over the cobblestones. The fire burned low in the grate, its soft crackle the only sound until Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps ascended the stairs. Moments later, she appeared at the door, her face a mixture of alarm and hesitation. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said, clutching her shawl tightly. "He insists it's a matter of life and death." Holmes looked up from his chair, his long, slender fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson," he murmured, his eyes glinting with curiosity. The man who entered was pale and disheveled, his coat dusted with snow, and his boots leaving damp marks on the carpet. He looked to be in his early 30s, though the anxious strain on his face made him appear older. He clutched his hat tightly, and his gloved hands trembled as he spoke. "Mr. Holmes, my name is Arthur Pennington. I've come from the village of Hawkhurst on the outskirts of Surrey. Something most dreadful has occurred, and no one can explain it." Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite. "Pray take a seat, Mr. Pennington. You have my full attention." "Begin at the beginning, always the best place." The man sat down, still shaking slightly. "It began 2 nights ago. My friend Henry Vane disappeared. He was last seen leaving the inn after supper, walking home through the fields. The snow was falling heavily, yet his footprints were found the next morning leading across the meadow, and then they simply stopped. Not a sign of him beyond that point. No struggle, no return trail, just gone." Watson, who had been reading the morning paper, lowered it in disbelief. "Stopped, you say? As though the man had vanished into thin air." "Precisely," Pennington said, his voice cracking. "The constable believes he may have fallen into the nearby brook, but the water was frozen solid. Others whisper of something unnatural. I came to you, Mr. Holmes, because I cannot accept the impossible." Holmes leaned back, his keen gray eyes fixed upon the man. "Impossible, Mr. Pennington, is merely the unexplained viewed too hastily." "Describe the footprints to me in detail." "They were clear as day," Pennington said. "Boot prints in the snow, leading straight from the gate of the inn to the far end of the meadow. Then abruptly nothing. The snow beyond was untouched for yards in every direction." Holmes rose, crossed to the window, and stood gazing into the fog outside. "The snow offers a perfect record of passage," he said thoughtfully. "A man cannot walk without leaving evidence. The absence of prints is as revealing as their presence." He turned sharply. "You say it snowed that night?" "Yes, sir." "A steady fall. The prints were made sometime between 9 and 10 when Henry left the inn." Holmes nodded. "And the body has not been recovered?" "No, sir. We searched the fields, the brook, even the woods beyond. It's as if the earth swallowed him." Holmes gave a faint, knowing smile. "An evocative phrase, Mr. Pennington, though I doubt the earth has taken such liberties." "Watson, I believe a trip to Surrey will do us good. The air here grows stale with routine." Watson sighed, already reaching for his coat. "I take it we leave at once?" "Indeed," Holmes replied. "If the footprints still remain, the snow shall be our witness." By midday, the train carried them south through the white-blanketed countryside. The rhythmic clatter of wheels filled the compartment as Holmes sat deep in thought, his gaze fixed on the shifting landscape. Watson watched him for a time before speaking. "You seem certain the explanation lies in something ordinary," he said. "Certainty is the enemy of reason, my dear Watson," Holmes replied, without looking up. "I am certain of nothing until I see the ground myself. Yet experience has taught me that even the most supernatural of tales hides a thoroughly human cause." When they arrived at Hawkhurst, the afternoon sun was already sinking behind the hills. The small village lay silent under its cover of snow, smoke curling from chimneys, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and damp wool. Pennington led them down a narrow lane toward the inn, a modest timbered building with frosted windows and a faded sign swinging in the wind. Inside, a few villagers turned to stare as the strangers entered. Holmes paid them no mind. He drew Pennington aside and spoke in a low tone. "Show us the field," he said. They left the warmth of the inn and crossed the road toward a gate that opened onto an expanse of white. Beyond the first few yards, the snow was smooth and untouched, except for a single set of prints that stretched in a straight line across the meadow. Holmes crouched at the edge of the gate, his magnifying lens appearing almost magically in his hand. The prints were deep and sharply defined, indicating a heavy man with a steady gait. Holmes followed them a few paces, then stopped abruptly where they ended. The snow ahead lay unbroken, a perfect sheet of white. He turned slowly, scanning the field, then knelt again, brushing the surface gently with his gloved hand. "Curious," he murmured. "No depression beneath the surface. The snow has not been disturbed since it fell. The man walked here and then, what? Leapt? Flew?" Watson frowned. "There's no sign of it. If he'd jumped, the snow ahead would show the impact. If he'd been pulled back, there would be drag marks." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Precisely. And yet the prints end as if he dissolved into the air." Pennington shivered. "We thought it witchcraft, sir." Holmes rose, brushing snow from his knees. "Superstition is a convenient cloak for ignorance. Tell me, Mr. Pennington, who first found these tracks?" "The constable early the next morning. He followed them from the inn until they ended here." "Was the snow falling when he arrived?" "Yes, lightly. He said the prints were already beginning to soften at the edges." "Then the event occurred at least several hours before discovery." Holmes mused. "Enough time for someone to alter the scene." Watson glanced at him sharply. "Alter it? You believe the prints may have been tampered with?" "Perhaps," Holmes said. "Or perhaps they were made to deceive." He began to pace slowly around the perimeter, eyes darting across the ground. "There is something else. Look here." He pointed toward a faint mark half buried beneath the snow's surface. A thin line, nearly invisible. Rope, perhaps? Or wire? Pennington leaned closer. "I hadn't noticed that before." "Few would," Holmes replied. "It runs parallel to the prints leading toward that clump of trees." They followed the line until it vanished beneath a drift near the trees. Holmes knelt again, brushed away the snow, and exposed a narrow metal rod driven into the ground. He tapped it lightly with his cane, and it gave a dull metallic ring. "An anchor point," he said softly. "Used recently." "For what purpose?" Watson asked. Holmes's lips curved in a faint smile. "That, my dear fellow, is what we must discover. But I suspect our missing man did not vanish at all. He was made to appear as if he had." As they turned back toward the village, the last light of day faded behind the hills, leaving the field cloaked in shadow. The wind picked up, carrying with it a low moan that made the trees creak and sway. Pennington glanced nervously toward the darkening woods. "Do you think he's still alive, Mr. Holmes?" he asked. Holmes adjusted his scarf and looked out across the field where the footprints ended. "Alive?" he said quietly. "That depends on whether he walked into this field of his own will or was led here." They reached the inn just as dusk settled, and Holmes requested that Pennington bring him every detail concerning Henry Vane, his habits, his acquaintances, his debts, his enemies. As Pennington recited what little he knew, Holmes took notes in a small leather-bound book, pausing only to ask sharp, unexpected questions. Did Vane have reason to fear anyone? "Not that I know of. He was well liked in the village." "Any disputes of late? A quarrel, perhaps?" Pennington hesitated. "There was a man named Briggs, the blacksmith. They'd argued over money owed for a horse, but it was settled weeks ago." Holmes made a mark beside the name. "And his family?" "None. He lived alone in a small cottage by the brook." Holmes closed his notebook. "Then that is where we shall begin in the morning." Watson looked up from his seat by the fire. "You intend to search his home?" "Indeed," Holmes said, "for a man's dwelling often reveals more of his character than his acquaintances ever could." He turned toward the window, where flakes of snow had begun to fall once more, erasing the prints in the field beyond. "We must hurry, Watson. The snow covers evidence, but it also preserves it, if one knows where to look." And as the wind howled through the eaves of the inn, Sherlock Holmes stood in silence, his mind already weaving the pattern of deduction that would soon unmask the truth behind the disappearing footprints. The wind had gathered strength by the time Holmes and I rose the next morning, sweeping over the village in icy gusts that rattled the inn's windows and howled through the chimney. The snow had fallen heavily during the night, burying all trace of the footprints we had examined. I found Holmes already awake, standing by the window with his pipe in hand, watching the swirling flakes outside. His violin rested on the table, its strings still vibrating faintly from some early hour's contemplation. "You slept little." "Holmes," I observed as I stirred the fire back to life. "Sleep is a luxury when the mind is occupied," he replied absently. "The snow has done us no favors. What was once evidence is now concealment. Yet sometimes, Watson, concealment reveals more than it hides. I knew better than to press him when he spoke in such riddles. Within the hour, Pennington had joined us, looking worn but resolute, and the three of us set out for Henry Vane's cottage. The village lay quiet beneath its fresh white mantle, smoke curling from chimneys. The crunch of our boots the only sound in the still air. The cottage stood near the edge of a frozen brook, half hidden among bare trees whose limbs bent low under the weight of snow. It was a humble dwelling, its thatched roof glittering with frost. Pennington unlocked the door with a shaking hand, and we stepped into the dim interior. The air inside was cold and stale, heavy with the faint odor of smoke and damp wool. A few coals still lingered in the hearth, long since extinguished. Holmes's eyes swept the room with quick precision. Across the table set for one, the boots by the door, the overturned chair. "Observe," he murmured, kneeling by the hearth. A kettle half filled and untouched, yet the fire burned out. He intended to return shortly. No sign of hasty departure. "Watson, what do you deduce?" "That he left expecting to come back," I said. "There's no sign of struggle here, nor of forced entry." "Precisely. He left willingly, or was persuaded." Holmes moved to the small writing desk in the corner and examined a stack of papers, then paused at a sealed envelope resting atop them. He held it to the light. "Addressed to Arthur Pennington," he noted. Pennington frowned. "To me? But I've never received any letter from Henry." Holmes handed it to him. "Then perhaps it was never sent." "Open it." Pennington tore it open and read aloud, his voice unsteady. "My dear Arthur, if anything should happen to me, do not believe it accident. I fear I am watched, though I know not by whom. There are strange sounds near the brook at night. Footsteps, yet no one there. I have told Briggs, but he laughs. Still I feel eyes upon me. Yours, Henry." A silence followed, broken only by the faint crackle of the hearth. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Watson, note the phrasing. Footsteps, yet no one there. It seems our friend Vane was haunted by the same phenomenon that now perplexes us." Pennington looked pale. "He spoke to me of fears once or twice, but I thought it merely his imagination." "Fear seldom invents from nothing," Holmes replied quietly. He began to move about the cottage, inspecting every inch of the small space. The window sills, the floorboards, even the ceiling beams. His movements were deliberate, precise, his mind working far ahead of his hands. Then quite suddenly he stopped at the rear window. "The snow outside is freshly fallen," he said, "but beneath it there are older marks. See how the layer dips here?" He brushed away the top snow to reveal a faint impression, as though something heavy had been dragged or rolled. "This occurred before last night's fall. Toward the brook, no less. Come." We followed him outside, crossing the frozen yard to the water's edge. The brook lay still and glassy under its crust of ice, the surface so clear that one could see reeds and stones beneath. Holmes crouched near the bank, tapping the ice lightly with his cane. "Thick enough to bear weight," he murmured. "And yet look here. Discoloration beneath a shadowed patch." Watson leaned closer. "Good heavens, it looks like fabric." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "So it does. Pennington, fetch the constable. We shall need his assistance in breaking the ice." The constable, a stout man named Cooper, arrived within minutes, breath misting heavily as he surveyed the scene. With his help, we broke through the ice where Holmes indicated. The cold water beneath surged upward, dark and silent, and as it cleared, a gasp went up among us. Caught beneath the frozen surface, face turned upward in ghastly stillness, lay the body of Henry Vane. Pennington staggered back with a cry, covering his face. The constable muttered a prayer, while Holmes merely stood in still contemplation, eyes fixed upon the dead man's boots. When at last the body was pulled to the bank, Holmes knelt beside it, examining the soles. "Remarkable," he said softly. "Not a trace of snow within the treads. Yet these are the very boots that made the prints across the field." Watson frowned. "But how could that be? He must have walked there. Or someone wearing identical boots," Holmes replied. He rose and turned to the constable. "When was the last snowfall before the disappearance?" "The night before," Cooper said. "Heavy flurries till near midnight. Then the prints were made after that, and if Vane had already been dead, someone staged his path to suggest a vanishing act." Holmes began to pace, hands clasped behind his back. A clever illusion, one to divert suspicion from the true method of murder. Pennington looked up, still trembling. "You mean someone killed him first, then faked the footprints?" "Precisely. A man cannot vanish, Mr. Pennington, but he can be made to seem as though he did. It is a performance worthy of the stage. But who benefits from such theater? We carried the body back to the village, where it was laid in the constable's care. By the time we returned to the inn, dusk was falling once again, the air thick with the promise of more snow. Holmes ordered tea and sat silent for a long time, staring into the fire. I had seen that look before, the stillness before the strike of reason. At last he spoke. "You recall the name Briggs, the blacksmith?" "Yes," I said. "Pennington mentioned him as having quarreled with Vane." "Indeed, and where there is quarrel there is motive. Yet motive alone does not make a murderer. We shall pay Mr. Briggs a visit tonight." We found the blacksmith's forge at the edge of the village, its chimney still faintly smoking though the workshop was dark. Briggs himself emerged from the shadows when we knocked, a burly man with a beard singed by years of heat and sparks. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "You'll be the London detective they're talking about." "Sherlock Holmes," my companion said evenly. "We've just come from the brook." Briggs stiffened slightly. "Then you've found him, have you?" "We have," Holmes said. "And now I would like to know why you were seen near the meadow the night before his disappearance." The man's face hardened. "Who says I was?" "Your own apprentice, Mr. Briggs. He mentioned seeing you leave the forge around 10 heading that way." Briggs hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "I went looking for him, that's all. He owed me money. I thought he'd run off again. I never found him." Holmes studied him silently, then let his gaze drift to the workbench behind the man, where a coil of thin steel wire gleamed faintly in the lamplight. "Tell me," he said softly, "do you use that gauge of wire often in your trade?" Briggs followed his glance, his brow furrowing. "For shoeing harness lines, why?" "Because an identical wire was found anchored near the field where Vane's footprints ended." "Curious, is it not?" The blacksmith's jaw tightened. "You're calling me a murderer, is that it?" Holmes's tone remained calm. "I call you nothing, sir. But I should advise you not to leave the village until I have finished my inquiries." We left him glowering in the doorway, the orange glow of the forge flickering behind him. As we made our way back through the snow, I turned to Holmes. "You believe him guilty?" "Not yet," he said. "But I believe he knows more than he will admit. The wire, the footprints, the positioning of the body, all elements of design. But by whose hand? Briggs is strong enough for such work, but not subtle enough to devise the illusion. No, Watson, there is another mind behind this, a mind that understood the art of misdirection." "And where do we find such a person?" "In due course," Holmes murmured. "But tonight I intend to revisit the field. There is one question still unanswered. The height of the footprints themselves." "The height?" I repeated, puzzled. "Yes. If my theory is correct, the prints were not made by a man walking upon the snow, but by a device suspended above it. That would explain their abrupt ending." "You mean someone lowered false boots on wires?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "Exactly so. The disappearing footprints were never made by a man at all. The wind carried our breath away in white plumes as we crossed the silent village once more. Behind us, the church bell tolled the hour, its sound rolling out over the dark fields where the snow lay smooth again. Waiting, as though the earth itself held its breath for what Holmes would uncover next. Night had deepened over Hawkhurst by the time we reached the meadow once more. The snow, now hardened under the cold moonlight, glimmered like a field of crushed glass. Each step we took crunched sharply, the sound echoing through the still air. Holmes moved ahead with deliberate caution, his lantern held low, its flickering light sweeping across the white expanse. I followed in silence, my breath forming pale clouds before me. "Watson," he said quietly, not turning his head. "You recall the wire we found yesterday anchored in the snow?" "Of course," I replied. "You believe it was used to suspend something? Perhaps the boots that made those prints?" "Precisely. If the contrivance was indeed a suspended mechanism, it must have required 2 fixed points. One here, the other likely near those trees." He gestured toward the dark outline of a grove at the meadow's edge. "Come. We shall see if the night conceals what daylight overlooked." We reached the trees, their trunks creaking faintly in the cold. Holmes set his lantern on the ground and began to clear the snow with swift, methodical movements. Within moments, his hand struck something solid. He brushed away the remaining snow to reveal another metal stake, identical to the one near the field's start. A length of broken wire trailed from it, glinting faintly in the lamplight. "There," Holmes murmured. "Our second anchor." The contraption ran the length of this field. Imagine it. 2 stakes, a taut wire stretched between them, and boots fastened upon it, guided by pulleys. A simple, elegant illusion. I bent closer. So the prints were made by a man operating this device from afar? Not afar, concealed among the trees, I should think. Once the boots had crossed the field, he detached the apparatus and buried it beneath the snow. The next morning's storm erased what little trace remained. It was no ghostly disappearance, Watson, but a fabrication of remarkable cunning. "And the purpose?" I asked. "Why go to such trouble merely to feign a vanishing act?" "That," Holmes said, rising to his full height, "is the one element still clouded. A man is found dead beneath the ice, and yet his apparent footprints suggest he walked away. Whoever engineered this scene intended to mislead us as to the place and perhaps the time of death." We stood in silence, the only sound the whisper of wind through the trees. Then Holmes's lantern flickered, its light catching on something half buried near the base of one of the trunks. He knelt swiftly and retrieved it, a small metal clasp no larger than a coin engraved with the faint impression of a bird in flight. "Curious," he murmured, turning it in his fingers. "A motif, perhaps from a uniform or a piece of equipment. The workmanship is delicate, far and even." Before I could reply, a sound reached us, a faint crackle like the snap of a twig. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once, plunging us into darkness. The moon cast long shadows across the snow. We listened. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the soft crunch of approaching steps. Holmes whispered, "Keep low." Through the trees emerged a solitary figure carrying a lantern of his own. The man was wrapped in a heavy coat, his shoulders hunched against the cold. The light revealed a coarse, familiar face, Briggs, the blacksmith. He stopped near the very stake Holmes had unearthed, stooping to examine the ground. "Remarkable," Holmes breathed, his voice scarcely audible. "He returns to the scene, perhaps to remove what he fears we have found." We watched as Briggs knelt, tugging at the wire still half buried beneath the snow. Holmes's hand brushed my sleeve, signaling me to remain silent. But then, as the blacksmith straightened, his lantern beam swept across us, and he froze. "Who's there?" he barked. Holmes stepped forward calmly. "Mr. Briggs," he said, his voice cool and even. "I might ask you the same question." The man's eyes darted from Holmes to the wire, then back again. "I was only checking the field," he stammered. "Didn't want anyone hurt by this contraption." "A noble sentiment," Holmes said dryly. "Though one wonders how you knew it existed." Briggs's face flushed red. "Everyone in the village knows you're poking about out here. I thought I'd lend a hand." Holmes studied him in silence for several moments. "Your hands, Mr. Briggs," he said at last. "Show them to me." The blacksmith hesitated, then held them out. Even in the dim light, I saw the raw abrasions across his palms, fresh as though from handling wire or metal under strain. Holmes's expression did not change, but I knew at once he had noted it. "Very good," he said softly. "And now, Mr. Briggs, you will accompany us back to the inn. I believe your forge may hold the answers we seek." The blacksmith muttered a protest, but Holmes's tone left no room for argument. We escorted him back through the snow, his lantern swinging nervously in his grip. When we reached the inn, Holmes requested that the constable join us there, and within minutes Cooper arrived, still buttoning his greatcoat. Holmes gestured toward the blacksmith. "Our friend has been less than forthcoming. I suggest we examine his workshop together." Reluctantly, Briggs led the way, unlocking the heavy door to the forge. The heat within struck us at once, a harsh contrast to the night outside. The air smelled of coal and iron. Tools hung neatly upon the walls, and in the corner, under a stained cloth, Holmes found what he sought, a spool of the same fine steel wire, and beside it, 2 metal pulleys smeared with soot. "Excellent," Holmes said, lifting one. "The same diameter as the wire in the field. You have been industrious, Mr. Briggs." Briggs's voice trembled with indignation. "It's not a crime to keep spare wire. I use it for work." "No doubt," Holmes replied. "And yet I suspect this particular work was not for shoeing horses. Tell me, how much were you paid to assist in constructing the illusion?" The man blinked, his mouth opening soundlessly. "Paid? I don't know what you mean." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Come, Briggs, let us not waste time. A man of your trade would not devise such a scheme alone. Who instructed you? Who gave you the design? The blacksmith looked from one face to another, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. At last he muttered, "I don't know his name. He came to me a fortnight ago, said he needed a setup to test the strength of wire across distance. Paid me well for my silence." Holmes leaned forward. "Describe him." "Tall, pale, wore gloves even indoors. Spoke like a gentleman, but his eyes cold like glass. Said he was from Oxford." "Oxford," Holmes repeated softly, as though the word carried some private weight. "And did he return after the disappearance?" "No," Briggs said. "Not since that night." Holmes studied him a moment longer, then turned to the constable. "Keep Mr. Briggs in custody for now. He may yet prove useful." As we stepped out once more into the night, Watson could contain himself no longer. "Holmes, this grows stranger by the hour. What sort of man stages such an elaborate deception, then vanishes himself?" "The sort who wishes to hide the true purpose of his crime," Holmes replied. "Briggs was merely a tool. The architect lies elsewhere, perhaps in Oxford, where Vane once lived before settling here." He glanced skyward, where the moon hung low and pale. "We shall know more when we visit the farmhouse near Hollow Lane. It was mentioned by Pennington, the property Vane had been renting in secret. He spoke of it as a retreat for his experiments." "Experiments?" I asked. "Yes, chemical, perhaps electrical. He was no mere farmer. Pennington said Vane had an interest in engineering and optical illusions, an unusual combination. If true, the farmhouse may hold the key to understanding why a man so obsessed with perception met his end beneath the ice." The thought sent a chill through me greater than the cold itself. As we turned back toward the village, the snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, muffling our footsteps and swallowing the world in silence. Holmes walked ahead, his coat dark against the white expanse, his figure cutting sharply through the mist. I sensed the machinery of his mind turning, each discovery locking into place with dreadful precision. Whatever truth awaited us at Hollow Lane, it was clear that the mystery of the disappearing footprints was no longer a simple question of illusion. It had become a web of deceit, spun with careful intent, and Holmes was already drawing the threads toward the center. When at last we reached the inn, the lanterns in the windows burned low and the village lay sleeping. Holmes paused at the door, glancing once toward the snow-covered fields beyond. "Tomorrow, Watson," he said quietly, "we go to Hollow Lane, and I believe before the day ends, the invisible hand behind this affair will no longer remain unseen." He spoke no more that night, but as he stood by the hearth, the reflection of the firelight flickering in his eyes, I knew with certainty that the game was no longer merely about a man who had vanished. It was about the power of deception itself, and the dark mind that wielded it. The following morning broke gray and soundless, the heavy clouds pressing low over the frozen countryside. A thin mist hovered above the fields, blurring the line between land and sky, as though the world itself held its breath. Holmes was already awake when I stirred, seated at the small writing table in our room, the remains of an untouched breakfast beside him. His eyes were bright, sharp, alive with that peculiar fire I had come to recognize as the herald of revelation. "Watson," he said without looking up, "I trust your constitution can withstand another walk through the countryside. We depart for Hollow Lane within the hour." "I am ready," I replied, pulling on my coat. "Do you expect to find something there?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Expectation is a dangerous indulgence, but I hope to find an answer, or at least the shadow of one. There is a pattern here, my dear fellow. A symmetry of deception. The illusion in the field, the false footprints, the letter left unsent, all part of a larger orchestration. The farmhouse at Hollow Lane, I suspect, was its stage. By the time we reached the outskirts of the village, the mist had thickened into a dense shroud, muffling sound and swallowing distance. The narrow lane wound between frost-laden hedgerows, leading toward a lonely rise where a small house stood, its roof bowed under the weight of snow. It was a desolate sight, the kind of place that seemed forgotten even by time. Pennington had given us directions the night before, but had chosen not to accompany us, his nerves still raw from the previous day's discovery. As we approached, Holmes stopped abruptly, stooping to examine the ground. "Observe, Watson," he said softly. "Wheel marks, narrow, made by a small cart, not a farmer's wagon, and fresh within the last 24 hours. Someone's been here since the snow, I murmured. Precisely. And yet this house has been uninhabited for weeks. Curious. He straightened, his expression unreadable. Keep your revolver near at hand. The game grows delicate. The front door hung slightly ajar, its latch broken. Holmes pushed it open with the tip of his cane, and we entered. The air was stale and bitterly cold. Dust lay thick upon the furniture, but a few footprints, muddy, recent, marred the floor near the hearth. Holmes crossed to the fireplace and knelt, his fingers sifting through the ashes. Still warm, he murmured. Someone lit a fire here last night. He examined the remains more closely, drawing out several fragments of burnt paper. He turned one piece toward the light. The edges were blackened, but a few lines of ink still clung to the page. The design must be completed before... He read aloud, his voice quiet but taut. Ah, but what design, and for whom? He rose and began to move through the small rooms, examining every shelf and shadow with his lantern. In one corner of the back room, he stopped so abruptly that I nearly walked into him. Against the far wall stood a wooden workbench, cluttered with tools, sketches, and glass vials. Holmes leaned closer to inspect them, his fingers hovering above the drawings. They are plans, he said, his tone edged with fascination. Mechanical diagrams, pulleys, harnesses, and wire arrangements. Note the precision of the measurements, Watson. The device in the field was only a fragment of what was intended here. I bent to look. The sketches were intricate, lines and numbers interwoven like the veins of a leaf. It looks like some sort of lifting apparatus, I said. Indeed, Holmes replied. Designed to carry weight along a suspended line. Ingenious in its simplicity and deadly in its purpose. But these notes suggest refinement, as though the inventor sought perfection. He lifted one page and read the name scrawled at the bottom. Dr. Elias Vane. Good heavens, I said. The same surname as the victim. More than the same, Holmes murmured. I suspect our Henry Vane was no innocent farmer, but the inheritor, or perhaps the assistant of this man's work. Elias Vane, an engineer dismissed from the Oxford Society of Science for dangerous experimentation in mechanical illusion. A recluse declared dead 5 years ago, yet his designs live on. Then Henry was continuing his father's research, or attempting to bury it, Holmes said. The line between the two may be thinner than we think. A sudden sound interrupted him, a faint creak from the upper floor. Holmes's hand went to his pocket. Upstairs, he whispered. Quietly now. We ascended the narrow staircase, each step protesting underfoot. The upper landing was dim, the single window veiled by frost. From behind a half-open door came the soft rustle of movement. Holmes pushed the door open with a swift, fluid motion, his revolver raised. A man stood by the window, his back to us. He turned slowly, revealing a thin, pallid face and eyes that gleamed with an unnatural intensity. His hands were gloved, though the room was cold enough to make that unremarkable. Still, something about the deliberate composure of his posture sent a chill through me. You are trespassing, he said in a low voice. This property is private. Holmes did not lower his weapon. Then perhaps you will forgive the intrusion, sir, if you tell us who you are. The man smiled faintly. I am the caretaker. Dr. Vane's affairs were entrusted to me after his death. Indeed. Holmes's tone was mild. And what care does a caretaker take that involves midnight visits and burning evidence? The man's eyes flickered, but he remained still. You overstep, Mr. Holmes. The designs in this house were never meant for the eyes of the public. They were the work of a visionary, and like all visionaries, Dr. Vane was misunderstood. Holmes stepped closer, his gaze piercing. A visionary who murdered his own son to preserve his secret? For the first time, the man's composure cracked. You know nothing. On the contrary, Holmes said softly, I know that Henry Vane feared the very footsteps that haunted him. I know those footsteps were the echoes of his father's invention, a device meant to defy perception itself. And I know you, sir, are not a caretaker, but a collaborator. The stranger's hand darted toward his coat pocket, but Holmes was faster. In one smooth motion, he struck the man's wrist with his cane, sending a small revolver skittering across the floor. The constable's timing could not have been better. Cooper had followed our tracks from the village and appeared in the doorway, weapon drawn. Hold him, Holmes commanded. He won't run now. The man sank into the chair by the window, breathing heavily. You think you've uncovered the truth, he said bitterly. But you haven't the faintest idea what he achieved. Elias Vane was on the verge of conquering invisibility. Not magic, not trickery, but science. His son was weak. He wanted to destroy it all. I couldn't let that happen. Science in service of deception, Holmes said coldly. And you killed for it. The man laughed, a hollow, broken sound. He would have squandered his father's brilliance. I only ensured his legacy survived. Holmes said nothing more. The constable bound the man's hands and led him downstairs. As their footsteps faded, Holmes stood silently by the frosted window, staring out at the pale expanse of the fields beyond. At length he turned to me. You see, Watson, the footprints that disappeared were never the mystery. The true puzzle lay in the human mind, in how far it will go to conceal its own illusions. He knelt to gather the remaining papers from the workbench, sliding them into his case. These designs will go to Scotland Yard. I trust they will find safer hands there than in the House of Madness. As we left the farmhouse, the mist began to lift, revealing the faint glimmer of sunlight breaking through the clouds. The snow stretched unbroken across the meadow, hiding beneath its still surface the traces of deceit, obsession, and tragedy. Holmes paused once more at the gate, his eyes narrowing against the pale light. Elias Vane sought to erase the line between the visible and the unseen, he said quietly. And in doing so, he erased his own son. There is no invention worth such a price. We walked on in silence, the crunch of our boots fading into the calm of morning. Behind us, the farmhouse at Hollow Lane stood empty again, its windows like blind eyes staring into the white distance, a monument not to genius, but to the peril of those who mistake illusion for truth. We returned to London under a veil of fog so thick that even the lamps along Baker Street seemed like smudges of amber behind gauze. Holmes was silent during the journey, his gaze distant, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I had grown accustomed to this introspective quiet that followed a breakthrough, but this time there was something heavier beneath it, a stillness that felt less like triumph and more like unease. When at last we reached Baker Street, Holmes went directly to the fire, tossed his coat onto the back of the chair, and drew from his pocket the bundle of papers recovered from Hollow Lane. He spread them out across the table in careful order, the faint scent of smoke still clinging to them. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, tapping one of the blueprints. This was no crude contraption. Vane's mechanism incorporated an optical component, lenses, mirrors, and a phosphorescent coating. The intention was not merely to vanish from sight, but to manipulate light itself. I bent closer, tracing the neat lines and notations with my eyes. "It's remarkable," I said. "If this design truly worked, then it could render a man unseen," Holmes finished. "Not by supernatural means, but through precise geometry and chemistry. The disappearing footprints were a mere symptom of a larger deception." He fell silent for a moment, staring into the fire. Yet something remains unresolved. The caretaker claimed Elias Vane had achieved invisibility, but the device itself is nowhere to be found. If Henry Vane destroyed it, why were the fragments not in the field? And if he did not destroy it, then where has it gone? Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson's soft knock interrupted us. "A letter for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, handing him an envelope marked with the seal of Scotland Yard. Holmes broke the seal and read quickly. "Ah," he murmured, passing the note to me. It was from Inspector Lestrade. The prisoner taken at Hollow Lane expired this morning. Poison concealed in a ring. Before dying, he whispered only one phrase: "The Phantom Cobbler." Holmes's eyes darkened with interest. "The Phantom Cobbler," he repeated thoughtfully. "An underworld artisan known for crafting disguise equipment and mechanical curiosities. His real name, Erasmus Cole, has been whispered in certain circles for years. He is said to build devices for thieves who wish to become ghosts." "Then he must have supplied Vane," I said. "Or perhaps," Holmes said softly, "Vane supplied him." He rose abruptly, pulling on his coat. "Come, Watson. Lestrade will have Cole's file at the yard. The dead may not speak, but the trail of their craft often does." The journey through the London fog was as silent as the grave. By the time we reached Scotland Yard, the gas lights along Whitehall glimmered faintly through the haze. Lestrade met us at the entrance, his expression drawn and uneasy. "He's dead, Holmes," Lestrade said as we entered his office. "Didn't even last the night. Took us half the morning to trace the ring's mechanism. Hollow shaft filled with cyanide, old trick. But the phrase he muttered before he went, it gave me a chill. Holmes nodded curtly. You have Cole's record? Lestrade produced a thin folder and spread it across the desk. Engineer by trade, dismissed from several firms for unethical experimentation. Last known address, St. Olave's Lane, near the river. Been missing for months. Rumors say he's taken work designing stage illusions for the Blackfriars Theater. Holmes's eyes gleamed. The theater, Watson. The natural refuge for those who live by illusion. The cobbler who crafts invisibility for the stage may easily adapt it for crime. Lestrade frowned. You think he's alive? I think, Holmes said, that a ghost is only as dead as one's eyes permit. We left the yard at once, the fog thickening into a damp curtain that made every street lamp shimmer like a halo. The air reeked faintly of the river, a cold metallic tang that clung to the throat. The theater district lay in shadow, the stages dark between performances, the narrow alleys echoing with the distant murmur of voices and the faint strike of hooves on wet stone. Holmes led us down a side passage behind the Blackfriars Theater, where the scent of oil and old wood hung heavy. Notice, Watson, he said quietly, pointing to a set of footprints leading toward a side door. Fine-soled boots recently made, yet the right heel bears a peculiar indentation, as though the wearer favored a hidden compartment. A craftsman's mark, perhaps? He tried the door. It opened with a groan. Inside, the theater was unlit save for a single lamp burning near the stage. The vast emptiness swallowed sound. We moved cautiously along the wings. The smell of grease paint and sawdust thick in the air. On the workbench near the stage lay tools, fragments of metal and scraps of cloth stitched with thin silver thread. Holmes examined them in silence, then turned over a small wooden crate. Inside lay half-assembled mechanisms, mirrors, wires, and glass lenses shaped like elongated eyes. It's the same construction, he murmured. Cole was rebuilding Vane's invention. From the shadows at the edge of the stage came a faint cough, followed by a voice, a slow, rasping drawl. You shouldn't have come here, Mr. Holmes. We turned sharply. A man stepped into the lamplight. He was tall and gaunt, his coat hanging loose on his frame. His right boot bore the distinctive dent Holmes had observed. His hands were stained with soot and his left eye was clouded, a milky haze that gave him the look of something half alive. Erasmus Cole, I presume, Holmes said calmly. Cole inclined his head. What remains of him, perhaps? Elias Vane was a fool. He sought to make men invisible through science. I sought to make them immortal through anonymity. You see, gentlemen, the perfect crime is not one that cannot be punished, it is one that cannot be seen. You assisted in a murder, Holmes said sharply, and your apprentice paid with his life. Cole's smile was thin. He was weak. Henry feared the truth of his father's genius. When he destroyed the prototype, he destroyed progress itself. So I completed what Elias began. He reached toward the bench where a small brass control rested beside the tools. The final adjustment, he murmured. Would you like to witness what the future looks like, Mr. Holmes? Holmes moved forward, but too late. Cole pressed the lever. Instantly, the lamplight fractured, scattering in unnatural ripples across the air. For an instant, Cole shimmered and then vanished. Good Lord, I gasped. Stay calm, Watson, Holmes said, his voice clipped. He's not gone, only hidden. Listen. The faint scrape of movement came from the far side of the stage. Holmes seized a handful of dust from the floor and flung it toward the sound. The particles caught against an invisible outline, a blur in the shape of a man. There, Holmes shouted. He lunged forward, striking with his cane. The blow landed solidly and a sharp cry rang out. The outline flickered, then collapsed. The illusion broke. Cole reappeared, writhing on the ground, the control mechanism sparking beside him. Holmes kicked it away and knelt beside the fallen man. Cole's breath came in ragged gasps. You cannot stop it, he whispered hoarsely. The world will not see its own ghosts. I merely gave them form. Holmes's expression was unreadable, and yet for all your brilliance you could not conceal your own vanity. You left your signature on every mechanism you built, the heel mark of the cobbler who could not resist leaving his trade. Cole gave a shuddering laugh, then fell still. The last spark from the mechanism faded into darkness. For a long moment, the theater was utterly silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock above the stage. Holmes rose, dusting his hands. The phantom cobbler, he said quietly. A man who wished to disappear from judgment and succeeded only in vanishing from life. We left the theater without another word. Outside, the fog had thinned, revealing the faint glow of dawn along the river. Holmes stopped by the embankment, gazing at the water where the reflection of the city trembled like a ghost's face upon the surface. "Watson," he said softly, "there is no invention so dangerous as the one that convinces man he can escape the eye of truth. The world is full of shadows, but they exist only because there is light." We walked on, the wind rising from the river, carrying away the last traces of illusion. The dawn that followed was a wan and colorless one, the kind that seemed reluctant to rise at all. I awoke to the faint crackle of the fire in our sitting room, and to Holmes pacing before it, his robe flaring with every turn. He had been up the entire night, his violin untouched in its case, his eyes carrying that cold glimmer which told me the problem had only deepened rather than resolved. Without looking at me, he said, "The case is not yet concluded, Watson. Cole's death closed one chapter but left another dangerously ajar. Something larger than either he or Vane was at work." I rubbed the sleep from my eyes. "You mean the device there's another?" Holmes nodded slowly. Cole was rebuilding, yes, but he had already built. That prototype we destroyed was not the first. He must have succeeded once before. It explains his confidence, his composure, even as the mechanism failed. Somewhere, Watson, a perfected version of that apparatus exists, and someone else now holds it. He turned abruptly to the table, where the blueprints from Hollow Lane still lay. Note the marginal annotations in a second hand, see here and here. A different ink and written in haste. Cole's handwriting is sharp and precise. These are not. They belong to another, someone who understood enough to assist but lacked mastery. I examined the notes closely. Could it be Vane's son? Holmes shook his head. No, these were written after his death. The phrasing is too self-assured, the tone proprietary. Phase completed. Awaiting the benefactor's approval. You see, Watson, this was never about invention alone, it was commerce. Cole had a buyer. A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with the Morning Post and an apologetic look. "A gentleman left this envelope not 10 minutes ago, Mr. Holmes," she said. Wouldn't give his name. Said it was urgent. Holmes took it without a word. The paper was thick and unmarked, save for a small wax seal stamped with the image of a coiled serpent. He broke it open and unfolded a single sheet. I caught only a glimpse of the words before he read them aloud. "You have meddled in affairs you do not comprehend. Leave the matter of Vane to its rightful heirs or vanish." As he did. Beneath the message was a faint impression of something pressed into the paper, a footprint, perfectly formed yet incomplete at the heel. Holmes studied it in silence for several moments, then looked up, his expression unreadable. "So the shadow steps into the light. Our correspondent is bold and careless. This imprint was made with soot, not ink. Fresh enough to trace the composition. Fetch your coat, Watson. We must pay a call to Scotland Yard." By midday, we were seated once again in Lestrade's office. The inspector looked up from his papers with a groan. "Another letter, Holmes?" "You'll have my department chasing phantoms till spring." "Not phantoms," Holmes said, handing him the envelope, "but prints. The soot contains a residue of camphor and alum, stage powder of a kind used in theatrical effects. Our adversary, it seems, has inherited not only Cole's invention, but also his taste for the dramatic. Find me a man who purchased large quantities of camphor dust within the last month." Lestrade scribbled a note to one of his clerks, then leaned back with a sigh. "You're telling me this isn't over?" "On the contrary," Holmes replied. "It has only just begun." The clerk returned less than an hour later, his face pale with excitement. "We found a purchase record, sir. 5 tins of camphor and a crate of brass fittings ordered by a Mr. Basil Torrance. Address, King's Row near the docks." Holmes's eyes lit briefly. "Basil Torrance," he murmured. "Financier, collector of curiosities, and, if rumor serves, patron to certain questionable minds in the field of experimental optics. It fits perfectly." By late afternoon, we found ourselves once again navigating through the fog-choked streets, the air thick with coal smoke and brine. The house on King's Row stood at the edge of the river, tall and narrow, its shutters drawn. Holmes knocked twice, softly, before the door creaked open to reveal a butler, whose face betrayed neither surprise nor curiosity. "Mr. Torrance receives no visitors without appointment," he said. Holmes Holmes smiled thinly. Then kindly inform him that Mr. Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street has arrived without one, but intends to leave with his conscience. The man hesitated, then ushered us into a dimly lit foyer. The house was filled with strange objects, lenses, prisms, and mechanical fragments displayed like relics in glass cabinets. The air smelled faintly of oil and metal. Moments later, Torrance himself appeared. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and his expression carried the calm assurance of wealth that had never been challenged. "Mr. Holmes," he said with the hint of a smile, "your reputation precedes you. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes regarded him steadily. "To a device of invisible consequence," he said. "The late Elias Vane built it, Erasmus Cole refined it, and you, Mr. Torrance, financed it. I trust I do not overstate." For a fleeting instant, something sharp flickered behind Torrance's eyes, but his tone remained cool. "You give me far too much credit. I merely fund promising ventures. The device you mention, regrettable business. I understand it met an unfortunate end." "Indeed," Holmes said softly, "and yet its shadow lingers still. A letter bearing your seal was delivered to me this morning." Torrance's smile faltered. "Then I suggest you handle your post more carefully. Many unsavory individuals would use my name to shield their mischief." Holmes moved closer, his voice low but precise. "Unsavory individuals rarely use soot mixed with camphor dust. That powder stains in a way common only to your laboratory filters. It seems, sir, your fingerprints have betrayed your attempt at invisibility." Torrance's composure cracked. "You cannot prove anything." Holmes's expression hardened. "You mistake me, sir. Proof is the province of the courts. Truth is mine." At that, Torrance's mask dropped entirely. "You meddle in matters beyond your grasp, Holmes. The device is no weapon, it is liberation. Imagine a world where men are freed from observation, where power exists without scrutiny. Do you not see it? The future belongs to those who can walk unseen. The future," Holmes said coldly, "belongs to those who can look upon themselves without flinching. You mistake concealment for strength. It is weakness dressed in brilliance." Torrance laughed, a low, hollow sound. "You moralize, yet you spy for a living. Tell me, Mr. Holmes, how different are you from the men you chase?" Before Holmes could answer, a movement from the landing above caught my eye. A figure stood there, thin, cloaked, a faint shimmer surrounding him like heat over a flame. The air bent subtly, distorting the outline of the man. "Holmes," I shouted, but he had already seen it. The figure moved, descending the staircase with measured steps. The distortion pulsed and then flickered out, revealing a young man with pale skin and eyes that burned with feverish light. "My name is Lawrence Vane," he said. "My father's work was stolen, his genius mocked. I will restore his name by finishing what he began." Holmes's face went still, his mind racing behind that unblinking stare. "So the heir reveals himself," he said quietly, "and the device lives again." Lawrence's gaze shifted to Torrance. "You promised support. You swore my father's legacy would be respected, not sold." Torrance's calm broke into anger. "You were paid to build, not to moralize." In that instant, Lawrence reached for a small brass controller at his belt. Holmes lunged, but too late. A burst of light flooded the room, dazzling white and soundless. The air wavered, and both Lawrence and Torrance were gone. When my vision cleared, Holmes was already at the window. "They're fleeing," he said, "toward the river. Quickly, Watson!" We burst into the night air, the fog rolling thick along the docks. Footsteps echoed ahead, then silence. Holmes stopped abruptly, his lantern cutting a narrow circle of light over the cobblestones. There were prints, clear and deep, running toward the pier, and then they ended. The river moved sluggishly beyond, black and endless. Holmes stood motionless, his face pale in the glow. "It seems," he said quietly, "that the footprints have disappeared once more." He turned slowly, his voice colder than the wind off the Thames. "This time, Watson, they vanished not into mystery but into consequence. And I fear the next to surface from those depths will bring with him something far more dangerous than invisibility." The fog closed in around us as he spoke, and the river swallowed the light. The wind off the Thames cut through my coat like a knife as Holmes stood motionless at the edge of the pier, his gaze fixed on the black water. The faint glow from the gas lamps trembled across the surface as though afraid to illuminate whatever secrets hid beneath. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The night seemed to listen, heavy and alive with the slow pulse of the river. "They're gone," I said at last. "Holmes, the current—" He raised a hand, silencing me. No, Watson, not gone. Men who believe themselves unseen seldom drown quietly. They linger in the shadows they worship. His eyes, keen even in the half-light, scanned the opposite bank. They will resurface, but not here. He turned sharply, the decision already made in that swift, precise way of his. Come. There is one last thread left to pull, and it will not wait for daylight. We made our way through the sleeping streets, the fog curling low like smoke. When we reached Baker Street, the lamps still burned, though the clock had struck 2. Holmes set immediately to work, scattering papers across the table. The surviving diagrams, Torrance's purchase records, the soot-stained letter, all of it became part of a larger, invisible design. He did not speak for nearly an hour. Then, without preamble, he said, Watson, I have been wrong about one thing. I looked up from the armchair where exhaustion had begun to claim me. Wrong? Yes, I assumed Torrance and the younger Vane shared ambition. But their motives were never aligned. Torrance sought profit, the power of invisibility as a tool for espionage, coercion, perhaps even warfare. Lawrence Vane, however, sought vindication. He sees himself not as a criminal but as a prophet wronged. That distinction makes him far more dangerous. I frowned. And you think they've turned on each other? I am certain of it. Holmes rose abruptly and crossed to the window. The fog outside was beginning to thin, the first gray hint of dawn creeping into the sky. If Torrance has the device, he will hide. If Lawrence holds it, he will use it.
Either way, he cannot resist revealing himself. He turned, eyes gleaming.
We shall invite him to do so. Within an hour, the plan was set. Holmes penned a short notice for the Times disguised as a scientific editorial. It praised the late Elias Vane's theories of optical refraction and claimed that his final invention, long thought destroyed, had been recovered, intact by private researchers, who intended to unveil it at a public demonstration. Within 48 hours, as Holmes sealed the envelope for delivery, I stared at him in disbelief. You mean to bait him with a lie? With a mirror, Holmes corrected. He will see himself reflected in it and come forth to shatter it. Mark me, Watson. Our adversary will not allow his father's creation to be paraded by strangers. Pride will drive him into the open. And so it was set. For 2 days we waited. The tension in our room so thick that even Mrs. Hudson tiptoed about as if afraid to disturb the air. The article appeared in print the following morning, and by evening, Holmes's eyes had that electric brightness I knew well, the look of a hunter who has scented his prey. Shortly after dusk, a telegram arrived. Holmes read it, and his mouth curved into the faintest smile. He's taken the bait, he said simply. Lestrade reports a burglary at the Royal Optical Society. The intruder bypassed the guards and escaped unseen. Quite literally. There can be little doubt. We were out the door within minutes. The society stood off Cavendish Square, its windows black against the lamplight. Inside, chaos reigned. Papers strewn, cabinets broken, instruments overturned. The night watchman, pale and trembling, swore he had heard footsteps circling him in the dark, though he could see no one. Unseen but not unheard, Holmes murmured. He moved quickly through the wreckage, stooping often, his eyes darting. There was no theft, he said at last. He wasn't searching for valuables, he was planting something. Planting what? I asked. Holmes's gaze fixed on a corner of the laboratory, where a faint shimmer danced across the air, almost imperceptible until he raised his lantern. There, half concealed behind a stack of crates, lay the completed mechanism, sleeker, smaller, humming with a low electric pulse. He leaned close, studying it. The perfected version, he said quietly. Vane completed what his father began. But this is not designed to conceal one man. It's configured to project invisibility, to cast an entire field. Imagine it, Watson. An army that vanishes at will. Before I could respond, a voice echoed from the darkness beyond the corridor. Imagination, Mr. Holmes, is the first step to understanding. We turned sharply. Lawrence Vane stood in the doorway, pale, his coat glimmering faintly with the same refracted light as the machine. The effect gave him an almost spectral appearance, as though he hovered between the visible and the unreal. You've saved me the trouble of retrieval, he said. How considerate. Holmes did not move. The device is flawed, Vane. Your father knew as much. He abandoned the project for a reason. Because he feared it, Lawrence hissed. He feared what he could not control. But I am not afraid. My father's vision was not to hide from men. It was to rise above them. To move unseen is to move unshackled. Holmes's eyes hardened. You have mistaken invisibility for freedom. One may vanish from sight, but not from consequence. Lawrence's expression twisted. Spare me your sermons. You and your Scotland Yard cannot comprehend what this means. Power without witness. Motion without restraint. I could walk through palaces, vaults, nations, unseen, untouchable. And utterly alone, Holmes said softly. A ghost among men, feared but never known. That is not freedom, it is exile. For the briefest instant, I thought the words might have reached him. His eyes flickered, uncertainty shadowing their brightness. But then his hand moved to the control lever at his side. I will show you what exile can do, he whispered. Holmes sprang forward, but Lawrence threw the switch. The machine roared to life, the air around us vibrating with a strange harmonic hum. The light fractured, the room bending as though submerged underwater. For a moment the world seemed to tilt, and then he was gone. Watson, shut off the generator, Holmes shouted. Sparks leapt from the console as I lunged toward it, fumbling for the lever. I found it and pulled hard. The hum collapsed into silence. When the air cleared, the room was still. The machine smoked faintly, the acrid scent of ozone filling the air. But Lawrence was nowhere to be seen. Holmes moved methodically, scanning every corner. He's here, he said quietly. The device burned out mid-transition. He's trapped between invisibility and sight. He crouched near the center of the room, his hand brushing faint disturbances in the dust, footprints faint and half-formed, as though belonging to something not entirely of this world. Then, from the far wall came a sound, a low, strangled gasp. We turned. For an instant, the faint shimmer returned, flickering like heat on glass, and then it faded entirely, leaving only silence. Holmes straightened slowly, his expression grave. The field collapsed inward, he said. He crossed a threshold no man was meant to cross. Lestrade burst in moments later with 2 constables, but Holmes waved them off. It's over, he said simply. The man you seek has ceased to exist in any state we can comprehend. We left the building as dawn broke pale and cold over the city. Holmes walked in silence for several blocks before speaking. You see, Watson, the pursuit of invisibility is not a search for power. It is a search for escape. From judgment, from morality, from oneself. Lawrence Vane inherited his father's brilliance, but none of his restraint. And Torrance? I asked. Vanished into the same night he sought to master, Holmes replied. His name will surface soon enough, attached to rumors, disappearances, and misfortunes. But his true punishment lies in what he can no longer control. We reached Baker Street as the first carriages began to rattle over the cobblestones. Holmes paused at the door, his face drawn but calm. Do you recall what I told you, Watson? He said softly. That the footprints were never the true mystery? The disappearing prints were only the echo of a mind that believed it could outpace truth. But truth, like light, always returns no matter how long the shadow lasts. He stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a quiet click, and I followed. The morning sun breaking weakly through the fog, its pale warmth falling across the empty street where, for one fleeting moment, the faintest outline of footsteps appeared upon the frost, and then were gone.